Thank you all for joining. We will be starting shortly.
Can you see it?
Yes.
So today evening, I'm going to be reflecting on my planning practice and hopefully glean out some thoughts which can, lead to further discussion in the next session with John. And I really look forward to it. When I was in architecture college, there was a teacher that had very provocatively told us that we should be promiscuous, and the idea was basically she was speaking in context of theory, and she said that basically don't get too attached to one particular theory, think about different ways, traverse through different theories and ideologies, and critique them and then fall in love with them, like don't immediately get married to some particular ideology or theory. And I would like to say the same thing about organizations. So I you know my how so housing has been the constant site of interrogation of my work, and I have had the chance to sort of look at it, peer at it from different kinds of angles and windows and lenses, and you know uh, I kind of used the earlier career, in fact, just to jump from one organization to the other organization, often to the much disappointment of my mother, who wanted me to be in just one organization and like pull it through. But this kind of allowed me to play the field and also embed myself in different kinds of organizations and see things from their perspective. It helped me understand what are the powers of different organizations and what are their limitations. And so these are a couple of my housing projects that I worked with. And as you see, there are NGOs, there are semi-government organizations, there were governments that I was working for. I was working for engineers and doctors. I was working with academia, and I was also working with artists and think tanks. Like sometimes, just the opposite poles. Like the think tank was like a mission-driven think tank that wanted to push markets at the bottom of the pyramid, and like the academic work is very, very critical of markets. And this kind of allowed me to sort of understand the pros and cons of working, of embedding in these kind of different kinds of organizations. Now, I'm a planner, so I never had the satisfaction that architects have of building things, and there's never any kind of closure at the that materializes at the end. And I've realized that planning is actually an endurance sport in that manner, right? And so what keeps you in the game is basically your research questions, and then each place that you work in kind of provides you with some answers and a lot more questions. Yeah. So I'm going to show you my trajectory over 3 projects today. And I select these projects because they help me understand very unique aspects of what has come to become the dominant mode of planning in Mumbai, which is redevelopment. Working with different organizations has helped me understand redevelopment planning at various scales, and offered insights into what to do and what not to do, when you're doing this kind of work. For those of you, because I'm going to be speaking about redevelopment, I just want to make sure that everybody understands what redevelopment is. For those of you who don't know redevelopment in Bombay, what happens is that, say, for example, you're looking at redevelopment, right? And this is a piece of land which has slum housing. The dominant mode is basically to take the slum housing, which might be just G+1, G+2 story structures, and sort of like put them in taller vertical housing. And The remaining land is used for market housing, and the market housing, there is also a fragment of incentive FSI which is provided to make the market housing viable. And it doesn't have to be market housing, it can be even a commercial project or an institutional project. But this sort of like cross subsidizes the rehabilitation housing that is built. What is important to note over here is that in this entire process, nobody pays for the land, right? Like in the sense that that the slum housing is redeveloped in one corner, and then the remaining piece of land is actually just sort of given to the developer to build the market housing. And the way in this model, the way in which this model works is that the lesser space in which you kind of rehabilitate the people, the more the amount of land you get for market rate housing or market rate development that you want to do. Just something that we will come back to later again. Usually, this redevelopment takes place at very sort of small scales, like maybe 2,000 square meters of plot land or something like that. But somewhere around 2000s, what happened is that the government floated to redevelop 210 hectares of Dharavi as a tabula rasa plan. Now, actually, this is the kind of planning, I mean, people were talking about in 2005, 6, 7, when India was booming and the global economic crisis had not hit, and they wanted to do a tabula rasa redevelopment plan for this 210 hectares of land. And there was very little clarity, in the minds of the slum dwellers, like how was this planning actually going to happen? What kind, like, what are the pros and cons of this plan? And so at that time I was working with, I was just fresh out of college, and I was working with the Kamla Rahija Design Cell, and we had sort of tied up with Spark and a host of other people. It was like called the People's Coalition, and we were pouring through these plans to understand them better. Now, what so what we found out basically was that just had explained earlier, this was a profit-led model that promised all the residents who lived in Dharavi, promised to prior to 1995, later was extended to 2000, a free house. And I put this in air quotes because people in Dharavi already do have houses. But anyway, so this was this kind of formal free house that was going to be provided through redevelopment, measuring 269 square feet. And however, this promise of like a private property was accompanied by a host of negative externalities that we wanted to tell the people about, and so that they could be careful about what they are getting into. So we articulated this by saying that this was an ill thought out scheme, that it was actually it was a thinly designed real estate model that sought profits for state and developers, but it actually planned very little else. We said that the slum dwellers would be rehoused in vertical, tall apartment buildings, and the change in housing typology would not be conducive to their patterns of living and livelihood. So one has to remember that Dharavi is not just a residential slum, it's a small SEZ almost, right? Like in the sense there's a lot of industrial work that happens through Dharavi, home-based activities that happen over there. And sort of the typologies of, work and live would not be easily carried out in tall vertical buildings. We also showed them that it would increase the density, and very little infrastructure had been planned for the same. And most importantly, we told them that the plan was disempowering the community as it was not asking for their consent. So in this version of the plan, one has to remember that, the early redevelopment plans ask for 70% consent of the people who are going, the inhabitants of the land who are, people have to consent to the redevelopment. The slum dwellers have to consent, 70% of the slum dwellers have to consent to that redevelopment. That clause was taken out in this version of the Dharavi redevelopment plan. They said if the state is carrying it out and the state is elected by the people, then once the state gives the consent, you can go ahead and redevelop this entire slum. So at the end of this presentation, I remember, people started to like whisper, and the crowd started getting angry and anxious. And I must say that my young self felt like a superhero that day. Because I thought that, okay, we have managed to, tell the people what are the problems with the state plan. So we have done our job. Uh, but a week after that, what happened is that basically we started to get calls from different slum dwellers who were ready to negotiate on this plan. And so they were saying that, if we go ahead and do this redevelopment, then how will it work out? We don't have a developer doing this redevelopment. We'll do the redevelopment. We'll keep the profits. There was another set of people who said that what if we get like larger homes, then maybe we'll consent to this plan. And that's the point at which I got really like sort of, there were smoldering holes in my superhero cape, if I could say that. And that was mainly because I could not understand for the life of me, like, why are people negotiating with this plan? Like, this is a terrible plan. Why are people negotiating with it? And uh, that's when you realize that there were some people who were dead against the plan, some people who were sort of negotiating with the plan, some people who just wanted to move out of Dharavi, and the community was a heterogeneous bunch of people, and we were like constantly like idealizing them as this one community. And each of those people had different kinds of histories, right? In the sense, like, there were people who had a lease on land, like Kumbharwada had a lease on their land. There were people who owned property. There were people who were squatters in Dharavi. There were people who were, had industrial units. There were people who were just purely resident there for the sake of residential. There were people who were like, migrant workers who would come in for 6 months and go away. The plan was affecting people very, very differently. And like sort of my learning from that was that the worst thing that the plan did is actually did not sort of think about things from the point of view of this community, right? Like, in the sense, did not think about it through this heterogeneity, did not provide a framework for people to kind of like um, uh, come and negotiate at different levels through diverse points. Like that was the basic problem of the plan. And so that's when I realized that every plan should have two things. One is the scale, like one is the scale of like the macro and the micro and the meso, right? Like, and where there are certain things that can only be taken care of at the macro level, like for example the infrastructure, like for example what is the kind of amenities that are required for a certain kind of number of people. And there was another thing which was a sort of like a micro scale, where the design of the housing, the design of their own neighborhoods, typologies, etc., are things that people should have the sort of like the framework should provide a foothold for people to negotiate these things and plan with them. Not just the plan should not just come at the end and take consent from people. So these were my kind of like learnings from this fiasco in some ways. And moving it's not really a fiasco. I mean, like, the Dharavi redevelopment plan never really took off. But for me, that time when I was so young, like I thought that this was going not the way I had thought and planned it would go. Anyway, so moving on to the second kind of project that I have worked on, which is the Mumbai Development Plan. This is the plan which came out in 2015. There was another plan that came out in 2016. Um, and the one that finally got finalized, I think, was in 2018 or something of that sort. So basically, I worked on a plan which got scrapped. I worked for a plan on this plan for almost 2.5, 3 years, and it got scrapped. Talk about endurance. But I will not get into like why this plan got, like, I'll not get into the politics of why the plan got scrapped, or like dwell on it too much. But I want to talk to you about something very particular in this plan. Yeah, and so. I was really excited in 2012. Like, I had a chance to work on this plan, and I was approaching it from this idea of the scales and the frameworks, and I wanted to see how this translates at the master plan level, which is not just the scale of a neighborhood like Dharavi, but like an entire master plan. Like, how do we do this? And I particularly sort of worked on this on the FSI map, the floor space index map, for the entire city. Um, FSI or FAR, like the floor area ratio. I just want to once again explain this concept before we move on. What is the floor area ratio? It's basically the ratio of the plot area to the built area on a plot, right? So, for example, if you have a plot which is 100 square meters, and I have an FSI of 1, I can build 100 square meters. If I have an FSI of 2, I can build 200 square meters. Like so that's how the floor area ratio works. Anyway, what's interesting about this is that it tells you how much you can build on a particular plot. That's what you have to remember. And it's especially kind of appreciated by architects who want to have some leeway with design, instead of like height restrictions, etc. Like you can build higher, lower, etc. Anyway, moving on. So Bombay has a like everybody from Bombay understands FSI, okay, because it's had a very contentious history, and I'll explain it to you. Uh, so there are parts of Bombay that were developed, and they have an FSI of up to 5. Like in the old city, if you actually go there and you stand under any one plot, and you see the building is sitting plot to plot, and it's 5 stories tall, which means it has an FSI of 5. And the 67 plan actually came up with varying kinds of FSIs for the entire city. In 91, when the development plan was crafted, the planners thought that Bombay is becoming extremely dense, and so we should curb the FSI that we give out. And sort of like this is a folly in the brains of the planner, where they think that if you curb the FSI, you're going to curb the population of the city. What you end up doing actually is that you end up people start living in smaller and smaller houses, or start doubling up, like, because people will move where there is economic activity. And that's exactly what happened. Bombay in the 90s was a booming city, like people were migrating to the city, and the FSI was curbed by the planners, thinking that that way they will curb the population coming to the city. And so they curbed it to 1 in the suburbs and 1.33 in the island city. I mean, just to think about it, the island city was already consuming an FSI of 5. Like, curbing it to 1.33, people are not going to knock off their homes. You know what I mean? Like, so that kind of like problem always remained in Bombay. Anyway, I'll move on. So what happened is that this led to a very high so this led to very high land rates in Bombay. And people living in smaller and smaller homes, and wanting larger homes. And so when the economic sort of boom hits India, people want to consume more space. And that's around the same time when the Bombay Development Plan starts, the new one that I worked on starts getting conceptualized. And so one of the things that people really knew they wanted to do was to increase this FAR in the city. But they also sort of were very keen about, and I say people wanted to do because I was working with a large bunch of planners. I was not the only one, but basically we knew that we wanted to increase the FSI in the city, but also wanted to increase it in a manner that would make the city more efficient, right? Like, in the sense, we wanted to make sure that that people don't use cars, it becomes a walkable city, etc. And so the most obvious thing to do was to go ahead and delineate higher FSI along TOD zones. Yeah. And so, I'll not get into too much detail, but we sort of like figured out which are the stations where there was a higher footfall, drew TOD, sort of radii around it, drew TOD buffers, took care of where the employment nodes were, also went ahead and took care of where the existing FSI was higher, and using all of this, we put together this conceptual map. And this conceptual map, like, kind of, notes all the areas where there should be higher FSI and where there should be no lower FSI. And if you see, the final proposed map kind of mirrors that. Anyway, why am I telling you all this? Also, so just to kind of give you an idea, so this was the kind of like, distribution of FSI. The largest part of the city was falling under the FSI of 3.5 and 5, So the whole idea of doing this was to kind of like get rid of that scarcity that the earlier plan had created, and the attempt was to bring down the housing rates by increasing the supply. Um, Not everything in this plan is something that I agreed with, but there, but the way in which the TOD plan was worked out, I could sort of I put my weight behind that. Now, what happened is that some, like, there was an increase in the FSI, but then there was also a plan to go ahead and sell some part of this FSI. And this is a big trade-off, because, like, if you start selling the FSI that you're increasing, you're not just increasing the supply, you're still charging for that supply, right? Like, in the sense of how much effect does that have on affordable housing was a question that I really had. But this was the macro level, scale that I was interested in looking at. And then there would be another local area scale at which the built up areas would be further planned. Like, there was another kind of lever at which the community could participate, and then that was the thought of it. Now, this plan completely, like the FAR plan, completely bombed. Like, people did not like the idea of having differential FARs within a city, because that creates differential land rates. And if you're looking at the way in which redevelopment happens, it's already a kind of game of, the ways in which land rates work. And people had, developers had invested in slums, had invested in various kinds of projects already. And then suddenly this was creating a completely new regime of FAR in the city, which took people, by surprise. They were very used to the 1991 sort of like FSI regime, and it really sort of didn't work out. Whatever people's problems with the FSI plan, I also do think that there was another problem that happened over here, which was basically that people started to say that, TOD is a problem. Like, TOD will cause congestion in big cities because we were providing FSI in these areas. And this is an incredibly unfair assessment in some ways, right? Like, in the sense that TODs actually make cities way more efficient. But here, this kind of like, FSI was thought of bringing density, was thought of, creating congestion. What was creating congestion is actually the lack of like kind of, investment in infrastructure and sidewalks. And that is what required, curbing the car. Those were the things that were required. And also the TOD plan is a lot more than the FSI, right? Like, in the sense that it's about walkability, it's about safe streets, all of these kind of things. And this was anyway. But this battle, unlike the Dharavi battle, happened, at the level of the sort of like at the level of the slum in some ways, and this one was taking place at the level of the entire city. It was in the newspapers every day, and it was a very lively conversation that took place. The third way in which I have sort of had the chance to sort of, but what I was trying to say over here is that all of this you can kind of, understand way better because you are working from the side of the government and you understand their perspectives and the ways in which that they are trying to deal with this. Now, the third plan that I sort of worked with was actually with a set of doctors, okay? And I first met this gentleman, Dr. Ravikant, in a presentation that he was making. And in that presentation, he showed us this slide. And he asked us, what do you think those numbers on the side are? And somebody was like, is this the number of people living in these societies? Is this the number of, like various guesses? Is this the number of industries in this unit, etc.? And he said, no, this happens to be the plan of a housing society. And so each of these bars is actually a building. It's a G plus 7-story building. Yeah. So it's about 24 meters tall. Each of this is a building. And this is telling you the number of tuberculosis patients in each of these bars. And he knew this because his foundation, Doctors for You Foundation, actually has a DOTS camp inside this, in this building. Now, these happen to be, the rehabilitation colonies that I was speaking about earlier. Yeah. So if the Dharavi redevelopment plan was taken through, it would lead to this kind of built form structures. And I'll show you more images of it and I'll tell you more about it. This was earlier version of that. Like, so this had some project affected people. This had some, so this is the rehabilitation colony in the M East Ward in Bombay. And the doctors for you sort of like, foundation, these guys who were providing the DOTS program in these colonies actually found something peculiar. They were providing DOTS program in 3 separate colonies. Yeah. So there was the PMG colony, there was the colony called the Lalubhai compound, and there was the Natwar Parik compound. And what they found was that basically PMG colony had only, the burden of TB was only 1% in PMG colony, but Lalubhai compound had 8% families suffering from, having one person suffering from tuberculosis, and Natwar Parik compound had 10% families suffering from tuberculosis. Now, this is a very high rate. Let me tell you that. Like, even if one person in your colony gets COVID, you know the kind of like precautions that people immediately start taking and start getting scared about, right? So imagine there are like 10% of your families here have tuberculosis, which is sort of like, some of it is like even resistant to medication. So this is a very, very grave situation. Anyway, so now you're going to tell me, okay, fine, these are slum rehabilitation colonies, so people must have, got TB with them when they came to these colonies. And this is what the doctors found. They said that no, that is not the case. 80% of the people got tuberculosis after moving into these colonies. And their hunch was basically this. Just look at this. Okay, so this is the PMG colony. You can see this kind of facade is nicely lit with light, and it's coming down all the way over here. These are the colonies which are really dark at the base level. Yeah, this one has a lot of like garbage thrown in over here as well, because it resembles a sort of like a gully that nobody's taking care of. And the doctor said that the clue lies in this, that they thought that there was something to do with the build form that was leading to, this colony having such a low burden of tuberculosis, and this one having such a high burden of tuberculosis, in spite of the fact that people in this colony were all, all these 3 colonies had slum dwellers, or in fact, there were people who were moving in between these colonies. Anyway, so that is, so then IIT Bombay stepped in and did all of these, did the sky view factor and brought in all these equipments to and did modeling, and they found out that this is correct. There is very bad light and ventilation in these colonies. So what is it? Why is the architecture of these 2 colonies so bad? Like, are these just bad architects that are doing it? And the answer is, of course, not entirely, right? Like, because architects followed these design mandates of the development control regulations of the Bombay Development Plan, which sort of mandated them to build these colonies very close to each other. I'm going to go back to this, right? So this, you remember I was talking to you earlier about, how, so let me just tell you, the development control regulations tell you the distance between the buildings that have to be followed. It tells you, what the building height should be. It tells you what kind of window design should be, how much open space, how much unit density should be there. Now, these are different for general buildings and redevelopment buildings. So going back to this idea of redevelopment, yeah. So the way in which this plan becomes viable is that if you can put the highest number of people on the least amount of land. Yeah, so that you can get as much land possible. Remember, I was telling you this earlier, for market rate housing. And that is determined by the distance between the buildings, and so the building heights that you can provide, the open spaces, and the unit density. So you see how, like, in order to make the redevelopment plan viable, how you were cramping people up into smaller and smaller colonies. Now, let me explain to you how much this cramping is, okay? So these are the 3 colonies that we were studying, okay? And just look at this, okay? So the regulations tell us that the distance between the 2 buildings has to be the building height divided by 3 into 2. Now, this is too complicated, but let me just like simplify this for you. So if you have 2 24-story buildings, then you leave 8 meters for this building and 8 meters for this building. So there's 16 meters difference distance between the 2 buildings. That allows you good light and ventilation to come down all the way to the lowest floor. Yeah. In the case of these 2 buildings, this distance was reduced to 3. 3 meters. 16 meters, 3 meters. This building, which was probably built before, through general regulations and not the SRA regulations, had good light and ventilation coming in because of that reason. These did not. Okay, so for those of you who are more visual people, I will explain this to you. This is a 3-meter distance between two buildings that are 24 meters tall. This should have been the distance that should have been there. It's a drastic difference. And so what I'm saying is basically, and also for those of you, this is the other myth that got busted, right? Like in the sense that I used to think density is terrible, but actually this building is also pretty dense. The net density of units in this is about 900 units per hectare in this building. It goes up to 1100 in this building, but the PMG colony, which was the good building with only 1% of TB burden rate, actually is pretty dense. It's not dense. You know what I mean? And this, we argued, I was working with the doctors at that time, argued is actually illegal. And why I'm saying that is because if you see that there is something called discretionary powers in the development control regulations, which says that you can go ahead and relax some the requirements for distance between buildings if there are any kind of hardships in doing redevelopment, provided that the relaxation will not affect the health, safety, fire safety, and structural safety or public safety of inhabitants in the buildings and the neighborhood. And these relaxations clearly were doing that. So these are not fine. Yeah. And so we wanted to tell them to bring changes to the DCR and retrofit the existing layouts. Yeah. So this is another view of that, those buildings, and a lot of people have asked me, why didn't you just say that, the central line of buildings should be totally removed? And that would bring in enough light and ventilation. And the answer is basically that if you're working with if you're working with the community and they have given you their trust and they have given you, information about who has tuberculosis in their household and who does not, you cannot just suggest things which might cause problems to their, what if these buildings are brought down and then housing is not provided to the community? In summation, all through the COVID period, I've been thinking about this particular colony because like COVID, tuberculosis is also airborne. And I have wondered if the burden of COVID is just as high in these areas as tuberculosis was. I also have wondered that whether the people in Dharavi who wanted to negotiate, for redevelopment through larger flats would still do that if they learned that it would be detrimental to their health. I'm going to end this at this, and I will wait for your questions later.
Thank you, Namrata, for that insightful talk. I would like to ask Mr. Palmesino to present his work.
Thank you very much, and everyone at the Kurulavari Design Forum, and thank you, Namrata, for the great insight, in particular the relationship between the life, both of virus and humans and concrete. I'm going to show you some images in connection with some consideration with the question that you're posing about whether to build or not to build, which sounds a little bit Hamletic dilemma. Let me start sharing screen. The point is that in the last 30 to 35 years, we built so much that the conditions that have ensued to be completely transformed into a structure that establishes tools for public diplomacy. Negotiations, as we've heard from Namrata, are key to deal with the important question. But what is it really that we are trying to negotiate? And what does it mean to negotiate? Negotiation is mainly an encounter that transforms the different demands and of different parties. There's nothing pre-established. Years, we've built so much, and we have around 30 years to decarbonize completely our societies. So we have a sort of a symmetrical situation. And if we are all good boys and girls and manage our societies and manage to meet the minimum goals of the Paris Agreement, sea level rise in the coming century will cover areas that are now inhabited by 1.5 billion people worldwide. So we have 30 years, and this is the proposition, to completely change the way we think of dealing with the planetary dimension of architecture and planetary dimension of the built. And the proposition that we're putting on the table for the discussion today is to focus this effort of reimagining the decarbonization of our society as a project to reorganize what we call the sensible zone. The sensible zone is a very thin planet. It goes basically from minus 200 meters in the ocean. You see in this image the deepest abyss. And in 200 meters, there's still enough blue light for photosynthesis to happen. There's still enough light for proliferate and to initiate a trophic chain, a trophic cascade, so to say, upwards, all the way to 200 meters, where the majority of human populations happen. It used to be up to the 1950s that species that was basically distributed evenly in temperate zones. Today, we are coastal species and urban species. The vast majority of us lives in cities with high densities, low densities, but all of these cities are within, of the largest cities are within 50 kilometers, 100 kilometers from the coast. There will be enough embedded energy in the Earth system for the oceans to swell well beyond 4.5, 6 meters in the coming century, covering areas that are the most sensitive to life, the most sensitive conditions, but also they are the most built areas. It's where the entire global supply chain that is so much the conditions that we inhabit today is concentrated. So the images that you see are a series of visualization of remote, in the sense that the sensible zone is the most sensitive to variations and micro fluctuations of the fluxes of energy that constitute life on planet Earth, but it's also the most sensed and measured and articulated through technologies. And so the proposition is really to combine sensing technologies with sensing other transformation processes, to sense the landscapes, the habitats, the ecotones as they are developing. And here you start understanding that when we're talking about this mixed environment, it's really a condition of complete intricacy and dependency between fluxes of energy in the animal environment, in the human environment, in the technological environment, and of course in the plant and fungi environment. And all of this is in a very thin layer that we call the sensible zone. The sensible zone is, of course, a new figure in the making. It's a figure that we don't completely perceive. It's difficult to grasp. It's difficult to make sense of. But we think that it's also the horizon line in which we can start focusing our efforts for understanding what it could mean to decarbonize completely our societies and manage to create a planet that is inhabitable, not by humans only, but by entire life. What we're dealing with, of course, is a situation where cities have become enormous drivers of the transformation of the sensible zone and the transformation of the Earth as a whole. The amount of stuff, amount of material fluxes and sedimentation that is connected to buildings and to flow-to-area ratios and to aspirations to connect that is now becoming so of a magnitude so vast that is comparable to that of the entire biosphere, the entire sum of everything that is alive on the planet. And the energy structures that are associated with this are outdoing and overperforming the biosphere. That means that we are consuming more energy than the entire net primary production produced by the sun. So that big sound was to mark 30 trillion tons. We have made a little exercise at Territorial Agency with our friends from the Anthropocene Working Group, which is a group of scientists trying to evaluate the scientific evidence of the hypothesis of the Anthropocene, a new geological epoch marked by human activities. And we calculated in a rough way 30 trillion tons. 30 trillion tons is maybe the answer really to the question, shall we build or not build? We've built 30 trillion tons of stuff. That means an amount of rubble around 30 centimeters high everywhere. Literally everywhere, in the entire planet, 30 centimeters of rubble. But it also, you could start breaking it down and start making more sense of that figure of the sensible zone and how it interacts with the technosphere, the sum of all the humans, everything that we sustain our life on, for instance, domesticated animals, domesticated plants that we eat, the energy and information structures that are necessary to sustain humanity. And you start seeing that the rural housing accounting for 6.3 teratons. Teratons is a difficult unit, you know? But imagine that all the urban areas, and this is out of just a classification of urbanity based on governments, amount to 11. So there's a almost double. But it's not just the buildings, the roads, the railways, the cropland, the way that we move the topsoil. We completely transform the topsoil, pasture land that we've transformed entire landscapes in order to give food to our food. Land and eroded soils attached to this, plantations and forests that are associated with this. And of course, it's not only above sea level, it goes all the way to reservoirs and the troll seafloors. The trawling is like crushing lorries through a meadow in order to pick berries. No, it's like a complete crazy way in which we sustain ourselves through overfishing. The 30 trillion tons is the big question. From within, this figure of the technosphere appears as everything that we've designed. Have contributed to this, but not only engineers, geologists, scientists, doctors have all contributed to creating this new paradigm of the Earth that is equivalent in its self-organizing structures to the atmosphere or to the biosphere or to the geosphere. And all of this is, of course, sustained by fossil fuels. And the incredible thing of the technosphere is that it doesn't recycle. All the other recycle. We don't have forests that drown in leaves. You don't have you didn't have once, now we do have seas that are drowning in the debris of dead animals or plants collapsing on the seafloor. So the question from within is, you might think it's an issue of designing better, of using better the technology, but actually when you start on it, is complex figure that is self-organizing. And we are, of course, one of the major drivers, but we are not in charge of it. It's a self-organizing system. You start understanding that the entire question of trying to make the technical order to become sustainable intercepts the question of whether we should build or not. The first attitude will be to stop building, to retreat. But actually that will be completely a foolish idea, because we need to use more energy in order to recycle. And more energy needs to come from somewhere that we can deal with. And the incredible thing here is, of course, that we have quite a good understanding of how recycling can happen. And that is mainly through the help of photosynthesis. Plants. That is what can recycle the technosphere debris. The entire 30 centimeters that I mentioned before is, of course, in the sky. It's carbon in the sky. Not only built city, but carbon that we put in the sky, and it's going to stay there in the sky for hundreds of thousands of years, well beyond the half-life of radioactive decay. In thinking whether we should build or not, in my opinion, and at Territorial Agency we've been developing this quite a lot, is that we should start thinking of this project of decarbonizing society really as an architectural project. And architecture, we know very well, is not the building, it's not the material, it's the relationship between a polity and the spaces and the material spaces that it inhabits. It's the way in which we give shape to institutions, and I'm very happy that we started the day by discussing organizations and forms of institutions and the material space. In other terms, we are dealing with a gigantic project to reorganize in the next 30 years and redesign everything. The technosphere is the biggest challenge and the biggest thrust that architecture has in front of ourselves. It's the largest project that we've ever will face. The next 30 years are going to be crucial. And why is it 30 years? Why do we have 30 years to completely transform dams and the reservoirs and canals and reinstate the biosphere? It is 30 years because of this number. This number was measured this morning on the tip of Mauna Loa in Hawaii. It's 415.92 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Just to make you understand, the carbon dioxide is one of the major so-called greenhouse gases. And the last, this is a slightly older data on April 19th. You see the average over 1 week of carbon dioxide on top of Mauna Loa, which is one of the highest mountains in the world, in Hawaii. The previous observation extended not only a week, but a month. You see small variations, and the average stays more or less in a linear way. But if you start extending it out, you start understanding this incredible piece of architecture that Keeling shaped. It's the largest record that we have of our human activities. And I think it's really a monument, and it's an architectural monument, the Anthropocene. The last 6 months, you start seeing that it's rising. The last year, you start seeing that it rose and ebbed. It's a wave. And that has to do with the fact that the Keeling Observatory in the Mauna Loa is in the Pacific at such a high altitude that it measures the breathing of the planet as the seasons change. So you see that in the spring and the summer, there's more CO2 than in the winter, because of course the land distribution is very different in the northern hemisphere than in the southern hemisphere. And you start seeing this incredible thing that we start measuring the breathing of the planet, the breathing of the sensible zone, the places where CO2 is transformed into through photosynthesis. And you start seeing over 2 years, that line continues. And this is the entire record. it goes up and down, but every year slightly more up. And that is a constant line. It's not a curve, it's a straight line. And it really starts in beginning of 1955, but you start seeing, if you extrapolate that data with proxy data like ice core and tree rings, and you all the way to the Industrial Revolution, you start seeing that something is happening. There's a figure that starts looking like a hockey stick, and that is the problem of building too much, or building not in a not good enough way. And if we extend it even more, and we look at the entire Holocene epoch, which is the last epoch after the Ice Age, you see something completely unexpected. You have 11,000 years, almost 12,000 years of stability, and then there's a peak. That's the architecture of the last 100 years. If you look at it over a longer time series, and we go back to 800,000, see again the peaks and the falls of CO2 in the atmosphere, and you start seeing that since 1950, it's well off the chart. That is why we need to decarbonize in the next 30 years. If we have models that tell us that in the next 30 years we can decarbonize, it means that we need to completely get rid of the conditions through which we depend on oil in 30 years. If we won't have capacity beyond 30 years to reduce CO2 enough to actually have a world that is inhabitable. 2 degrees is the minimum level. Of course, we're talking about efforts to reach 1.5 degree warming. In itself makes the Earth extremely difficult to inhabit. So the proposition of territorial agencies to engage with new forms of diplomacy to bring these observations to the level of interactions where we can start discussing together how to interact with the technosphere.
So space has disappeared. We are sublunar, which is a completely new situation. And yet, the great discovery is that this is Earth in intensity, not in extension. So suddenly it has agencies. After having spent 3 centuries denying agencies to the Earth, I mean to the object, and making it dry, middle-sized goods, suddenly the Earth is back with agencies. Not as one, but full of agencies.
That was not only characterized by the financial and economic crisis that has, in a sense, preoccupied so many countries in the last few years, but also by the question of how will further science further accelerate the confidence, the momentum, and the willingness of countries to step beyond the current comfort zone of agreeing internationally on actions to respond to that scientific evidence.
So this is time.
So that's the first project that I mentioned about integrating an idea of diplomacy, it's the Anthropocene Observatory. And a second one is maybe a little bit more direct in action about how to build or not. And it's the Museum of Oil, where we try to document how we're making the difficult decision to keep oil in the ground. There's a project with Greenpeace and Bruno Latour. And the idea is that we have built a museum where in the museum, it's us. It's like a museum of people, of Paleolithic people in wonder and in bewilderment. How did they live in those environments? And we'll look at us puzzled, thinking, how was it that we were so dependent on oil? Again, that hockey stick curve. This is a global energy consumption from the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. That little wiggly line up there is the renewables. So you have biomass that is, and the burning of which is causing, of course, the brown clouds in India, coal, oil, gas, hydroelectric, nuclear, and renewables. What is interesting of the same data is if we look at them in relative terms, and you start seeing these peaks and one energy system after the other. What has happened is really that we went from city-states dominated by large forests surrounding them, and the polities, the architectures were those of a small polity, everybody knowing each other, organizing a small environment around them. And that has been transformed through the Industrial Revolution into the empires governed by large bureaucracies and parliamentarian structures. And that is the rise of the coal oil. And the oil industry that has taken over the coal from the beginning of the post-war period has given way to a new architecture, a new institutional architecture of the so-called international organizations. Think of the role in that of incredible architects like Jacqueline Turret, who invented the entire notion of planning in the 20th century. Now, the Museum of Oil is for us a space of negotiation. It's a space where information about our environment, and in order to start a very complex reorganization of our understanding of how to keep oil in the ground, with a very simple mandate: radical conservation. Conservation of the earth, conservation of life on earth in particular, and what we see is a sort of weird displacement. You don't really understand where you are. You're seeing here these big panels that indicate territories that are completely wrought by oil, but you don't really understand where you are, in the sense that you don't know in which you in the future looking back at us making the right decision, or in the current situation looking backwards at everything that we've been doing wrong. And how do we use this moments of displacement to start conversations that are otherwise too difficult to engage in the current institutions of the winning out of the international. The incredible thing of oil is that not many people grasp the magnitude of oil. We tend to think that the problem of the carbon fossils is primarily their impact on the environment. For instance, cutting the boreal forest in Canada in order to prospect for oil in the tar sands, or oil spills in the Arctic, or the difficult situation where even just looking for oil creates massive environmental destruction and disruption for mammals in particular. The point is that oil is everywhere, and it is the structure around which participation in democracy have been based. The difficult thing to see in oil is that we depend on it. We cannot keep oil in the ground. We completely are dependent on it. The technosphere makes us completely dependent on it. So the idea of the sensible zone is to start using the same technologies that are at the basis of extraction to somehow constantly monitor the environment and constantly start understanding how to negotiate with these transformations, how to start negotiate with the difficult making of this strata of rubble that we've described. How do we start thinking that it's impossible to imagine simply a return to the Holocene, the epoch in which we've developed our languages, our nations, our cultures, our literatures, and of course, our architectures and cities. So this is one of the projects that I wanted to put on the table, the Museum of Oil. And another one is maybe more connected to that idea of sea level rise, and it's oceans in transformation. And again, a problem that many of us have difficulty grasping is the fact that we still live in a culture, all of us, in different parts of the world, in different cultures, Black cultures, indigenous people, of course, empire, colonizers, colonized, all live still in a culture dominated by the Holocene. Salty water and fresh water was clear cut, and we are landlocked. we're land-based. So this is a place in Venice where we have a big exhibition called the Oceans in Transformation. And that line on the facade of an old is where sea level will be in the coming century. It's difficult to grasp, but we depend completely on the ocean. And the ocean is as built, if even not more, than to have an idea of this beautiful four-letter word, city, as the site of inhabitation and construction. Today, cities have expanded to encompass completely the abyss of the ocean's surfaces.
Hello, my name is Marcus Ryman. I'm the director of TBA 21 Academy and its home, Ocean Space. Ocean Space is a new center in Venice, catalyzing ocean literacy, research, and advocacy through the lens of art. It's a collaborative platform that brings together artists and scientists, architects and activists and researchers to together foster ocean imagination and ocean action. And as we're in Venice, of Ocean Space, we chose to work with an architecture collective called Territorial Agency and present their work Oceans in Transformation, which is the culmination of a 3-year long-term research commission that started with the investigation of sea level rise. And what better place to investigate sea level rise than in Venice? So I invite you now to follow me into the exhibition and see the work.
Territorial Agency has been investigating the Anthropocene, the age of the transformation of the planet, for about past decade or more, trying to contribute to the amount of knowledge produced by various scholars about this particular age and the transformations it brings about. Oceans in Transformation is an attempt to unravel the mechanisms of transformations on the planet from an oceanic point of view, meaning looking at the Anthropocene from the oceans. So the question they are posing initially is, how can we sense, how can we make understand the transformations of the oceanic, whereas the ocean is an area that is invisible, that doesn't allow, doesn't afford us a view into its body, if you want. So what instruments, what possibilities of knowing do we have in order to develop an image of the oceans and its transformation? One. And secondly, how can we bring together the various ways of knowing, the various sciences, investigations, data collected on the ocean, so that they form a body of knowledge and are syncretized as one coherent story of the ocean. And in order to do that, they have both developed an aesthetic representation. These are the fields of images and compositions that you see behind me, but also a conceptual repertoire that is very important for us to understand, because it is the ideas, the understanding, the ways of knowing that perhaps also lead us to a better safeguarding of the ocean in our future.
And the question is really, how do you bring people together? how do you gather different knowledges? How do you start negotiating and creating diplomacy in the sense that nobody has the rules of the engagement, nobody has the pre-inscribed ways in which we should deal with. We all come from long-standing, incredible cultures, and that have all developed in the Holocene. And how do we make that threshold pass into the Anthropocene and negotiate? And the question for me of that is posed by KVDF for
Please, could you give us a minute to just figure out the technical glitch? Mr. Palmesino, can you hear us now?
Yeah, I can hear you. Sorry, there was a little glitch. I got kicked out for a minute. Last part.
You were saying something. Please continue.
I don't know when I was cut off. I'm saying that the contribution that I'm putting on the table is this new figure in the making that Peter Haff and the people at the Anthropocene Working Group are calling the technosphere, where that weighs 30 trillion tons of stuff. And that is how much we built. In order to answer whether we can build or not, we have to realize that nobody can answer that question alone. It's not a question for architects or planners or individual organizations. We can only answer it together. And that means that we actual project to come together and to reorganize our societies, our structures, and our contribution is to do this in the next 30 years, focusing on the areas that are the most sensitive areas of the planet that can undergo major transformations that we've completely urbanized in the last 30 years through processes that Namrata is too well aware of. And we have 30 years ahead of us. Maybe we can do it better.
Thank you, Mr. Palmesino, for presenting your fascinating work to us. Through both these presentations, there were several things, such as the aspects of negotiations with the city and on another scale, negotiations with the environment and the climate that have completely left me intrigued. And until the audience sort of types in their questions, I would like to take this opportunity to ask you a few questions which came to my mind during the presentations. So as the theme of KVDF this year is critically looking at the role of and the position of designers, planners, and architects in a larger web of various disciplines, it is extremely evident through both of your works that you place yourself in this larger web of stakeholders and agencies. And you also do work that impacts and influences various fields beyond that of architecture and urban planning. So where is it exactly that you place yourself in this multidisciplinary ecosystem? Ms. Kapoor, if you would like to start off.
So, where do you practice from? Like, that is the question, right? Like, in the sense that how do you think about practice? Honestly speaking, You know, I was trained as an architect, and there are two things that I've always taken from that architectural education, right? Like, first is the question of where does this form come from, and the second question is basically what is the best form that actually suits this particular scenario. Um, and both of these questions always take you to people who are from diverse backgrounds. They are from the answers are never like straightforward. Like, you always have to interact with various kinds of professions when you're looking at it. So it basically depends on your research question. It depends upon like what is it that you're trying to sort of achieve and impact, and how have you come to that. uh, uh, so uh, like I said, like it's a very promiscuous field. Like, in the sense, I do not think of myself as placed in one place, So and it is a sort of like the bane of the profession itself, actually. It gives you certain kinds of tools to understand spatiality. It gives you certain kinds of questions, and then it takes you to all different sorts of people. That is one thing I wanted to say. The second thing, no, I wanted to say this earlier as well, is to sort of through we have always, through the architecture education, be taught to be very competitive, right? Like, in the sense that, like, you have to, this is your design, this is your project, this kind of a thing. But if you look at the kind of questions that you have, you can't be competitive. You have to be sort of collaborative, right? Like, in the sense, to be able to answer these questions, to be able to sort of like have impact through your work, you have to be collaborative in that sense. And so I have, I'll actually tell you through this kind of example. So if you think of it more like a jugalbandi, like in the sense, like jugalbandi is like this kind of soulful competition. What is a jugalbandi? Like, it's a form of, like, Indian classical music, where one person sort of plays something and the other person has to step up and play with you. It's a kind of a face off, but it's not really, because you're making music together, and sort of like, uh, you're competing against each other to show how well you can play your instrument, but you're also sort of like raising the bar, and you're kind of like seeing to it that, both of you all keep performing better. Because if either one of you fails, everybody fails. Like, the entire music fails for you, right? And so this is the kind of collaboration that you're looking for. You're looking to work with people who kind of like, are critical of your work, who raise you, but are at the same time working with you. These are the kind of like collaborations that you want to be building in some ways. And so this is the kind of thing, like, practice is interdisciplinary, not multi, but the interdisciplinary. You're working with people. And the second is that you're trying to have this kind of soulful competition, which kind of raises you to become better as a system and not just yourself. Yeah.
Mr. Palmesino, would you like to either answer the question or respond to that?
I mean, we are very undisciplined, so not really answer a question about discipline. Architecture is a border technology. It's really a condition of margins and borders. And I think that the way in which you can understand the ambiguity of images that we are producing, and the indeterminacy, which I gave you a glimpse of in this very quick presentation, is not the same ambiguity and indeterminacy that you will find in contemporary forms of intercommunication, for instance, dominated by the visual arts. But rather, it's a way in which we can project the different viewpoints of different disciplines, different actors, different citizens, about a specific topic, and overlay them. So we project them onto the margins in order to reveal the gaps, to reveal the fractures and the inconsistencies between the different ones. What we're really interested in is the multifaceted environments that we inhabit. And architecture, I think, is as good as any other way of dealing with this, but has two conditions that I think are important to deal with. The first one, of course, is a burden. We have the burden of the built stuff. And it's a little bit like Atlas. I don't know, in Indian culture, I don't think you might have a similar condition. You carry the burden of the planet. of course, of empire for Europeans. But on the other side, it still carries a conviviality and impetus. And the architecture is a very interesting situation because it's all about being together. Reminding always ourselves that the first primordial act of architecture is to separate. So this is a difficult condition. Architecture is a really difficult practice, and it is primarily a form of engagement with polities, with organizations, with institutions, and it's really demanding, in particular in the current climate, and for young architects to be able to overcome the fragmentation of our contemporary lives.
Thank you for that. I do have another question though. What is your view also on the need for advocacy and action, therefore, by spatial practitioners? And further, from your personal experiences, what kind of localized forces are needed to sort of sustain these principles in the long term?
I think that if I can go.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I'm thinking that the way in which advocacy and in particular activism used to operate were based on what our friend at Greenpeace, Charlie Cronick, would call the deficit paradigm, where you assume that there's a deficit or deficit in empathy, and if only you would know what I know, you would act differently. If only you would feel what I feel for the penguins, you would protect the penguins. And if only you would feel what I feel for dolphins, you will stop everything and go. It's a deficit paradigm of, and I think that is really on many levels still dominating the imaginary of what it means to be an activist today. I think it's a real pity that is still like this, and we have many organizations that act on that idea, and architecture is particularly connected to this. The more you know, the better you will be able to act. But actually, you start experiencing completely different reality in activism, in particular at the kind of activism where architecture is directly involved, and the practices that our friends and collaborators really are showing that architecture is a way in which you can be acting from within the practices, not articulating more awareness or explaining better things, but directly engage with the logics of negotiations, with the shaping of the board, of the chessboard, where the take place. And that's why I think there's an incredible power in some kind of ambiguous spaces, because they of course the art world, but not only. The university is now, of course, completely dominated. I hope that yours is still free of this, dominated by criminal activities engaging with production of knowledge and ideas of proficiency. They're no longer the space of liberation and the space of emancipation, but there are still ambiguous spaces where negotiation can happen. And who can be on the ground, you say? Who can be holding up this? I think we have to think of giving up completely the notions of representation. I think it's no longer possible to demand to others to act on our behalf, or to say this stands for that. We have to completely reshuffle the rules of what is an image and how that representational structures can take place. So imagine a young builder who has never experienced any kind of capacity of a craft, and suddenly is faced with very standardized and deprived way of constructing a standardized way. There's no way that is going to save the traditional ways of building. It's just, that's his world or her world. It's difficult, no? But if that person is entrusted with all their incredible intelligence and they really trusted, I'm sure that they could do something. Everybody can contribute. The incredible thing is that humans are intelligent. Everyone is intelligent, and we can all contribute. The problem is that we have disciplines, and disciplines are a way to tell people that they're not intelligent, the way of producing stupidity. I think it's a real disgrace that many academic organizations have entered completely into this world of telling people that they're not intelligent. Imagine how smart the young architects coming into schools are, 10 times smarter than the fifth year or the end year students, most of the time, because they have more enthusiasm. There's no prescribed notion of what you ought to do and what you shouldn't do. And that is the interesting situation which I think we should all strive to achieve, where there's no prescribed notion. Everything is up for grabs at the moment. We are in a situation where what we thought was good, development, progress, turns out to be bad. So we have to revise completely our ideas, our aesthetics, our notions of history, our notions of philosophy of history, and so on. So this is maybe to address your very pointy question.
No, I completely agree with John actually on this. I'm thinking about it. I mean, everybody wants to be good. Everybody wants to do the right thing. And yet somehow we are stuck in these kind of systems which do not sort of like take you towards, a better environment, a better built form. It doesn't take into inclusivity. It's like we are stuck in systems which don't necessarily sort of deliver in the ways in which they should. And I'm thinking about when you go to these protests, there is this chanting, the chants that happen, and one of them I remember goes like this. Like you'll say like the guy walking in front says "Pitra satta dhoka hai," "Dhakka maro mauka hai." So it's like that. Let's say. That here is an opportunity, let's push and sort of, get rid of this problem that we have, right? So they'll say things like, let's say something like this form of capitalism is terrible. We have a chance right now. Let's push and change things. Like that is how the slogan goes, right? And that's a very good slogan, because what it says is that when there is an opportunity, you need to really push. You really need to push. You need to sort of like, widen that crack. That is when you bring in all your representation. That is when you bring in all your sort of like, all hands on deck and push and make these changes as much as possible. So it's an extremely slow process, but I feel like it's one of the important things about advocacy is to actually see that point at which the push has to happen. You know what I mean? Does it make sense? Like what I'm saying? Like that's the kind of like thing that we have to get sharper and sharper to realize what might be the places at which we need to push and make changes. And I think that on the other front, we do have, over the years, we have developed sort of systems of organizing. We have developed systems of representation. We have developed, we understand that now. But that kind of like, what is the opportunity? What is the method that you're going to adopt is important. Yeah.
I had a question, and I think it got mostly answered in what John was also trying to answer, and then you sort of asked. But I'll still reiterate it and push it a little ahead, which is that in our universities, so to say, and because both of you have taught at university level, there is a need to sort of urgently put forth these questions of resources, land use, economics, etc. And they have to be discussed at a much larger scale beyond just the immediate contexts within, say, the architectural studios that happen in our schools. And in that context, John answered how they could sort of be pushed using giving them platform that is not preconceived. So in that sense, I would like to push that question forth again towards the younger designers that are going out, people our age, who are immediately creating things that are much smaller in a footprint or at a very smaller or immediate scale, but have understood obviously the problems at such larger scales. There's always this difficulty that one faces in bringing these two scales together. not really bring them, actually overlap them together, but to be able to do something that could make a change, not even at extremely large scale, but even if it has an immediate context. Would you, you could either go back into the pedagogy part of it, or also talk about how such small scale interventions or things that you would immediately do tomorrow morning can be something that could add up over time. The push that Namrata is also talking about, rather an architectural push in that sense, is it even possible to do it at this scale? And if yes, then how?
Namrata, it's your turn to answer this.
I don't think that we are just architects. You know what I mean? Like we are very varied people. Like we have a lot of ways in which we sort of we live in a particular place. We consume in a certain way. We sort of put out certain kinds of representations online of ourselves, of things that we sort of advocate for. There is a wide palette of things that we can be doing simultaneously, but sort of like in my experience, I've seen that this is extremely slow process. Like there is just no other way. What ends up happening is after a certain kind of point, like, for a lot of people, these questions fall away and life takes over in a manner which is rather banal. And the question is that how do you keep yourself engaged, keep yourself questioning? How do you keep yourself sort of like involved in things which are which push you to ask questions like the way you just did? I mean, that is a very big challenge, like when you are moving from a younger career, like an early career starter to like later stages. Like you start becoming part of larger systems, and you start becoming, there's this term, but the banality of evil is actually embedded in its systems, right? Like in the sense that, and you start becoming a part of that system and find it difficult to like step out and question it then. And so, yeah, I feel I don't have an answer there actually, but I do think constantly seeing yourself as more than an architect and asking these questions is important.
Thank you, Akshar. On many levels, your question presupposes something called scale, and also presupposes an idea of multiplication. So this is something that, scale is a property of navigation, not of an object. There's no such thing as scale. Notion that was invented really by architect, where you can scale things up and down, but and then it was taken over, like many concepts, that by the social sciences, in particular economy, and thought of the economies of scale. And architects use the notion of scale in a very different way than it was initially developed. We don't, when you talk about scale in architecture, you don't talk about 1 to 100 or 1 to 2,000. You're talking about the scale of the individual versus the scale of the city, which is a modernist idea. It really presupposes that you can divide the world up and then recombine it through multiplication. And I think that is really a bizarre idea, because you have to do double the effort and then you recompose it all the way up. I think that on that, having said that, the condition through which architecture operates are big and small things. And I understand that the idea of that you're referring to scaling things up. How do you start by doing practices that are within your reach, and then you scale them up and have larger movements? And I think this has really got to do with an idea of politics and understanding that even the word politics is so connected to architecture, in spite of the fact that the entire profession thinks itself as outside of politics. Politics is nothing else than the transformation of the city, of the polis. And this is architecture. What architecture does is to transform the city. The question I see is whether younger people can, and by the way, your generation is the majority of humankind at the moment. So There's not much that you need to demand. You're already in power. You already have all the capacity. And on top of that, you're at the peak of your creativity. The question I see is not whether you can be burdened by the difficulty of scaling things up, but of creating as many ambiguities as you can achieve. Not clarities and connections, but ambiguities. Because when there's an ambiguity, and this is something strange to say in an architectural education context, because the entire process is all about clarity. It's all about defining and definition, and things are clearly separated and articulated in. But ambiguity is what allows others to start interacting with your work. So if I look back at the things that I was doing when I was your age, they were so ambiguous and incredibly ambiguous, and for the wrong reason. And the misunderstandings were incredible. But everybody misunderstands in a different way, and that creates a possibility of effervescent interaction. I think that is the way I think that one can go about. And the other element is really to think that we have institutions that are so framed by modernism that are no longer tenable. So we have to really think negotiations in a completely new way, because we are all in flux. We are all trying to reshape and refine ground under our feet. And you saw before I had a little clip with Bruno Latour, and Bruno is all dedicated now to thinking, how do we land? How do we find the new common good? How do we find that? And the common good, which is politics, is by searching and making those searches as open as possible to other people, to ameliorate and be shared. So that, I think, is, even if you're doing something small, think that it's public. Architecture is always a public enterprise.
Thanks a lot for that.
Just one sec, John, I want to ask you in this context, as an opposition to modernist, thought, there was a phase in which, people spoke about like subversion, or they spoke about like being anarchist, or, and what is your stance on, have you come across any kind of subversive or anarchist sort of like, activities that are speaking to your work, or and what is your stance on it? Actually, on something of this sort.
Well, of course, if you think of some of the most incredible moments in architecture, probably the last moment when there was a cohesive approach was Team 10. And think of their Giancarlo De Carlo, Bachema, they were all anarchists. It's interesting, they were all anarchists, and I don't think they were subversive in that sense, but very skeptical of structures of government. And I think that goes back to the idea of representation, and whether we can have architecture that engages its inhabitants, and it's in ways that are lateral, where there's an horizontality, not only human to human, but or group to group, or pre-inscribed connections, but starting to really an architecture that is open on all sides, that can engage. And I think in that sense, probably the ultra-modernist notion is that of revolution, and the possibility of an entire system change, which has then been opposed by those who simply think that there's a drift and semi-stable structures, which is, of course, the way in which thinking has been completely subsumed by economic thinking, and in particular contemporary forms of hyper-capitalized finance. There's an idea of nature that is now so taken to the idea of economy. Emanuele Coccia describes even the entire notion of ecology and its development. No? It's the economy of the others, of the non-humans. Also the home. And the very horrible, everyone containing and observing you and telling how you ought to behave. You know, it's de-economize our cities, de-economize our ecologies and societies, and make societies a far more interesting condition.
Thank you for that. Yeah.
So, Mr. Palmesino, I have another question specifically, I think, for you, but Namrata, please feel free to respond also. So a lot of your work involves large data, global information analysis, and sort of working with multiple agencies together in the realm of territorial transformations. So how does this transform into built spatial relationships? And picking on one of the questions which we've got from the audience, can this difference also be made in influencing therefore the construction industry and construction technologies?
Well, I think that Namrata's example of the colonies is an incredibly interesting one in that sense. You saw, I think there were 3 regulations, apart from flow to area ratio, which determines but there was a regulation about public procurement and partnership, no? And that indicate a first area where construction took place. The second one was basically a basic understanding of sanitation, space in between buildings, sunshine and fresh air. And then there was a third one, which I think was really important, the window. Now, in that you might think, where is construction? There was little in those 3 points about construction. Didn't say anything that those buildings should have been in concrete. It didn't say much about the fact that they should have had a lot of air conditioning systems attached to them. They didn't say much about the fact that we think that we have to have a core and with lifts and staircases around them and slabs repeating all the same. It didn't say much about the ground floor. So what is it that changes construction industry? Is it those 3 rules, or is it the structures through which we finance buildings? I think in a very strange way, if I could try to provoke your thinking, it's the idea of the project. Architecture is so embedded with an idea of having a project, that establishes a clear and stable in the future and actualizes. And then through that set of drawings and images that architects create, legal practices come in, ideas of planning come in, financing comes in, and of course the project needs, and real estate operates really like this. You can even sell houses that are not even built, that they are just drawn. Why? Because what happens is that there is a project that maintains stability in the future of that drawing. And in order to have the stability, we need to have the projects actually being realized in sturdy way. They need to last. If you make a project that is designed to last, let's say 10 years, nobody will buy a house. If it lasts longer, you will buy it. And so you pour more concrete, you emit more CO2. You have workers, working conditions that are really deprived and very little skills, and you start having prefabricated elements, sometimes the size of entire parts of facades and floors, if not entire house, and being prefabricated and depriving knowledges of in habitation. So the project is really the problem. The project and the stability of architecture is what is causing the problem. And so if you start thinking of how we can change the built industry, which is a gigantic industry, 1/3 of any economy, at least, is dedicated to just building and maintaining structures around us. Now, I think that is where one could start a different imaginary. I think that if we would have ideas of public procurement or public control of buildings that demand that, let's say that your building after 10 years needs to be recycled. There will be more jobs for architects. Every 10 years you have to design something new. There will be better engineering ideas that need to make the buildings lighter so that they use less material. There will be far more intelligence occurred to it, but it's not happening. On the contrary, what is happening is more and more concrete being poured. And that is the paradox of the Anthropocene, that we all know about it, and yet we don't do anything. It's a real paradox of knowledge. It's really the moment where an idea of, let's say, the Enlightenment, where an idea that if you know better, you will act better, it's proven wrong. And we all know, we've known it for all of our lives, and still we don't do anything.
Namrata, if you would like to contribute to that.
There's a question, is that economical from the client's perspective? Well, if you imagine that the economical upheavals that we're going through, the largest economies of the world, China and the United States, have plateaued. Europe has seen the largest depression in the last year and a half since records have begun. Are we talking about, what are we discussing? Economical?
You know, I completely agree with John on this, in the sense that it's almost like nobody believes it's real. Like, you know, the systems just continue as if like it's not going to happen. And we'll have to kind of like make this idea of the client much larger, right? Like, in the sense that it's not your immediate client. There are many other kinds of clients that you are serving in that sense when you're building, like these externalities in economics language, but in the architecture language, who all are you serving when you're building something, right? Like, that's the kind of question at which it all comes down to. So yeah, that's what I try to think about.
But there's no externalities any longer.
Yeah,
that's the difficult part to understand. The entire notion of externality. We are all within.
We are all within that. Yeah, it's a.
So there's nothing that we can put somewhere else. No, we cannot hide anymore. And
very important point. Yeah.
I think it's important also to think that this very basic idea, for instance, to make it, it's a thought experiment. Imagine if you have a bridge that can last 10 years. Of course, you want to make it viable economically and from the point of view of the client. Of course. And I think you will be able to do that. We have all the know-how, we have all the capacity to organize ourselves, but we don't do it. So the question about the economy, for instance, at the moment, a friend of ours at AA is calculating the average lifespan of very complex building is 42 years. Is that economical from the point of view of an investment of many times multi-million euros? 42 years? I don't think so. I really don't think we are looking at the conditions of economy in the correct way. And also to think that the burden is only on the client versus the others. I think it's also a structure that we can learn from the difficult understandings of and learnings from that we have raised from the crisis of the oil industry. Oil companies will always say that it's the fault of the clients, that they want something easy to get. It's not their problem. So, and the client wants something easy to, so to think that it's the client that wants something economical, I think it's also a way of generalizing. I think it's, in that sense, it needs to be looked at case by case and in a more granular way. I think we really need to have a far more granular way of understanding architecture.
So this discussion has thrown light on a lot of ideas and thoughts that talk about sort of the deep interconnectedness of various stakeholders. And it was really fascinating to hear about how you see yourself within this, and also how as students and young professionals in that sense, we can also start thinking and probing these sort of questions further. And we would also like to end this question session here now due to time constraints, but we invite everyone who is participating and listening in this forum to feel free to add any further questions or comments to the KVD discussion forum on the website to continue the dialogue. So thank you to everyone for participating. Thank you, Ms. Kapoor and Mr. Palmesino, for your thought-provoking responses.
I said thank you for having us.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be on the same panel as Namrata, and having the three of you, actually 4 or 5, I don't know how many, 5. It's a fantastic situation that you're putting up. Thank you very much for having us.
Thank you, but there's a last minute question. If you would like to respond. Jay, would you like to come into the conversation? Or would you like me to read it?
Read.
Okay.
Yes.
Jay Kabadia, who's one of our panelists, student panelists, has asked, we observe 2 different perspectives of housing developments in the presentation. One which is existing, which are of almost 3-4 stories in slums, while the new proposed developments are more about numbers and economical factors, which influences tall structures, which is a different form of typology. What position does an architect take in such projects to balance different factors like social, ecological, psychological, etc., other than just economical?
I'll take this one. So basically, I don't think it is so much necessarily just numbers and economic factors and stuff like that. The main part is tenure. For a lot of people, there are 2 things. There is the idea of tenure, and there's the idea of like amenities that are there inside a house, which is sort of constructed through redevelopment, which are very important to people who participate in this kind of redevelopment. So yes, I completely agree with you that housing is incremental. Housing is a ladder that, in countries like India where loans are expensive and sort of not easily available to people begin small and start constructing out further. There's incremental building. It is a very efficient way to do it. And then you come to cities like, Mumbai, where basically land is so contested that people don't want to give you land rights. They don't want to give you the tenure rights. And they tell you things like that you can only, so for example, in Odisha, like land rights are right now being given, right? Like, so if I gave land rights within Mumbai, then the whole story would be very, very different. So it's not so much about numbers and economics and stuff. It has got a lot to do with what are the conditions under which you're ready to give tenure, what are the conditions under which you're not ready to give tenure. And then the question is how do you sort of upgrade these forms to sort of have or plan these forms in a manner that can actually deal with the upcoming challenges that are there, right? Like in the sense, so that's kind of important. And also, let me tell you, like, there is this notion that you have in architecture where, walk-up buildings are always better. It might not be so. Those buildings that I showed you, the PNG colony where light was coming down, streaming down all the way till the end, those are not walk-ups. Those are G+7 story construction in some ways, right? Like, but they're built so nicely that the quality and health in those buildings is way better than the other buildings that were built, which are sometimes walk-ups. Anyway, so I'm not going to open up a can of worms at this point in time. So yeah, thanks for that question.
So thank you again, and we hope to see you all tomorrow for the second discussion of the KVD forum, which is probing processes, understanding interdependencies. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, John. Thanks a lot. Thanks for answering my questions.
Bye, Namrata.
Bye.
See you soon. Bye, everyone.